Recorded Books presents an unabridged recording of Prehistory, The Making of the Human Mind by Colin Renfrew, narrated by Robert Ian Mackenzie, and directed by Abigail McHugh. This book is copyrighted 2007 by Colin Renfrew. This recording is copyrighted 2009 by Recorded Books. In this book, archaeologist and renowned scholar Colin Renfrew covers human existence before the advent of written records, which is to say, the overwhelming majority of our time on Earth. But Renfrew also opens up to discussion, and even debate, the term prehistory itself, as he chronicles our existence and our ongoing quest to understand it. And now, Prehistory.
Introduction. Prehistory is the story of human becoming. 5 million years ago, there were no humans on the earth, nor among the then existing apes and monkeys were there any that we could recognize as closely resembling humans in appearance or in behavior. Today we see humankind in all its diversity, from the hunter-gatherers of the polar ice or the arid lands of Africa to city dwellers of every nation in the world. We see the massive technological achievements, architecture, technology, literacy, travel, and the products of human culture, language, literature, music, the visual arts. How did these things come about? What happened to bring about these transformations? How did we come to be where we are now? What is it that we have become? These are the questions that we address in studying prehistory. Prehistory refers to that span of human existence before the availability of those written records with which recorded history begins. But literacy has been available in some parts of the world for little more than 2 centuries. So from a broad perspective, the scope of prehistory covers most of human existence. Moreover, since the earliest written records in the world go back to no earlier than about 3500 BCE, most of the subject matter of prehistory can be approached only through the pre-literate material record of the past as revealed to us through archaeology. For it is archaeology, the study of the human past on the basis of the material remains, that allows us to begin to approach those vast expanses of time, the millennia of early human existence, and to say something meaningful about them. Prehistory, then, refers to the lives of our first hunter-gatherer ancestors, and then to those early times when humans, through the development of agriculture, were able to turn away from a life of hunting and gathering and were able to live in villages and then in towns. Prehistory encompasses the formation of the first, more centralized human societies, when men and sometimes women became powerful, the emergence of the first civilizations in Western Asia, in Africa, in China, in Mesoamerica, the rise and fall of the first empires from the Aztecs of Mexico to the Incas of Peru. The term encompasses also those smaller communities in different parts of the world that continued as hunters, or developed as pastoralists tending their flocks. Prehistory thus designates a vast span of time. But the word has a second sense. It refers also to the discipline through which we study prehistoric times. Prehistory, or prehistoric archaeology, is a field of study involving an extensive battery of techniques used to study the material remains that document the human past. The distinction is important because the study of prehistory turns out to be a difficult task. Gathering the data is hard enough, involving painstaking archaeological excavations in different and often remote parts of the world. But the task of interpretation is even more difficult. For prehistory is the science of us. It is the discipline by which we study ourselves and investigate the way we have come to be as we are. The prehistorian keeps on having to re-evaluate what might seem to be the easiest proposition in the world. Who are we? Or rather, what are we? What does it mean to be human? What at first might seem obvious becomes, on examination, a more difficult question. As we shall see when we try to explain the various changes that have taken place in the human condition over the tens and hundreds of millennia of human existence, the explanations do not come easily. They require insights not only into the deep human past, but into the nature of human existence now. The voyage of discovery that takes us back into the remote periods of human development soon brings us back to the realities of human existence today. For that reason, the study of prehistory is a challenging undertaking, and our perception of prehistoric times, of the millennia of human development, is always changing. It is as if we are looking at the past through a mirror. It is a mirror that we ourselves have made, and one on which we are continuing to work. The image of the past that we see is one that we ourselves have constructed. It is one that is continually changing. The metaphor of the mirror is a valid one, I think, for it is only over the past 2 centuries that the notion of prehistory has existed at all. It was over those 2 centuries that the rise of archaeology revealed that there did indeed exist a remote human past. Until the middle of the 19th century, prehistory had been undreamt of. The word itself did not exist. At that time, the human past presented an intellectual challenge, and one that was difficult to tackle. The 18th century sage, Samuel Johnson, remarked, "All that is really known of the ancient state of Britain is contained in a few pages. We can know no more than what old writers have told us." At that time there existed no vision of a discipline that could yield systematic knowledge of the human past. It was natural, then, for Dr. Johnson to indicate that written sources for Britain before the Romans were very thin indeed. As we shall see in the next chapter, the discipline of studying prehistory became possible only when a number of related ideas came together. That process continues today as new methods of study, such as archaeogenetics, become available. Indeed, it was not until the availability of science-based dating techniques some 50 years ago that a secure chronology could be established for the development of human culture. Today, we can indeed sketch out the broad outlines of the development of humankind. These outlines form the basis for much of this book, but although we can construct a narrative, we are still unclear as to why things changed when they did, and what governed the pace of change. We are only now beginning to learn about the changes in modes of thought that may have underlain some of the major advances and transformations in the human condition. The challenge of developing a cognitive archaeology, the study, using the material record, of the development of human modes of thought, is an alluring one. It is an aspiration that underlies much of this book, to understand the formation of mind. There are naturally many books that offer an overview of prehistory, and one may ask, what is the need for another one? Gordon Child's Man Makes Himself is one of the best, but it was published 2 generations ago, in 1936, and was written before the radiocarbon method offered the key to the dating of the past. Graham Clark's magisterial World Prehistory, an outline, used that key in 1961 to give the first coherent overview, but it was a detailed region-by-region survey. Chris Scarr, in The Human Past, published in 2005, has edited the best recent survey, although in order to do justice to each region, it is now a work by multiple authors. Here, my aim will not be simply to narrate the success of archaeology in reconstructing our shared human past, although the first half of the book offers such an outline. My aim is rather to pose some questions, many of them still unanswered, about that past. For while it is fair to say that we now know a good deal about that past, the broad outlines of prehistory have become very much clearer in the past half-century, we still do not understand it very well. We don't really grasp why things changed when they did, sometimes quite independently in different parts of the world, or so it would seem, and why very often things didn't change much at all. I am interested in the origins of mind, in that uniquely human capacity to analyze the world and to express our worldview in symbolic form, not only in words, but in non-verbal communications, in gesture, in painting and sculpture, in music and dance, and in ritual. The different societies of the world had their different worldviews, their different cosmologies, their different moralities, their different systems of government, their different languages, perhaps even their different systems of logic. So the study of prehistory is not only the investigation of what is common to all humankind in our shared origins and our common existence upon Earth, the human condition. It is also the study of human diversity, of the way human individuals and communities have come to be so different, the product of different histories, of different trajectories of development. The exploration of the world over the past 2 centuries has given to us far more than was available to our predecessors, the opportunity to contemplate that diversity and perhaps to learn something from it. It is in that sense that the study of prehistory can tell us something of who, or rather what, we are. And despite the successes of 1.5 centuries of archaeological excavation and research, I'm not persuaded that the answer is yet a very clear one. In what follows, Part 1 sets out to review the development of the idea of prehistory and the growth of a scientific discipline centered upon the prehistoric past up to the last decade or so. It reviews concisely the way this new field of study has developed. Part 2 begins with a recognition that the study of prehistory has now reached a crucial juncture, with a narrative of past events and processes already offering a sound outline, but with real problems in understanding why and how the developments of prehistory occurred as they did. For a clear understanding to be achieved, a new kind of cognitive archaeology is needed. What this may look like is outlined in Chapter 6, Toward a Prehistory of Mind. The implications are discussed in the chapters that follow. Part 1. The Discovery of Prehistory. The dawning of the idea of prehistory is discussed in Chapter 1, culminating in the year 1859 with the establishment of the Antiquity of Humankind and the definitive formulation of the concept of evolution by natural selection. The development of prehistoric studies until about 1940 is outlined in Chapter 2, and the impact of radiocarbon dating along with other radiometric studies is surveyed in Chapter 3. These advances made possible the study of world prehistory. Its development from 1950 until the end of the century is surveyed in Chapter 4. The challenges to understanding that are posed by this developing narrative are addressed in Part 2. Chapter 1. The Idea of Prehistory. When Dr. Johnson asserted, "All that is really known of the ancient state of Britain is contained in a few pages," he was right. At that time, knowledge of the past was based upon the study of existing historical texts. 2 centuries ago, prehistory did not exist. Not only was there no discipline devoted to the study of prehistoric times, the study that we today call prehistoric archaeology, but more serious, the very notion of prehistory, in the sense of a broad stretch of time going back before the dawn of written history, had not been formulated. There was absolutely no notion that the human past involved tens of thousands of years of development and change. In Europe, many scholars followed the arguments of the 17th century cleric and biblical scholar Archbishop Ussher, who had calculated that the earth was created in the year 4004 BCE. This, to us extraordinary, claim was based upon his calculations using the generations of men set out in the Old Testament of the Bible. The other episodes of the biblical narrative could be seen to follow, making a coherent and self-consistent story. If the world had been created in 4004 BCE, it followed clearly that any notion of prehistory was superfluous, a concept almost unimaginable in the face of biblical scholarship. Many of the great literary traditions, whether in Europe, Western Asia, India, or China, had likewise no place for any such notion of deep time going back tens of thousands of years. Indeed, most human cultures, most societies, are founded upon and incorporate a view of the world involving a system of basic beliefs related to the prevailing religious tenets and observances that explain how the world came to be. In Europe, that system of beliefs meant Christianity, whether Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant. In Western Asia, it generally meant the faith of Islam. In both those cases, as with the Jewish faith, and indeed with many religions, the doctrine of faith involves a creation story, a creation myth. The creation myth generally sets out how the world began and how the human species came to be, often through the agency of the primary creative force itself. For believers of the monotheist faith, that force was God, and for the sons of Abraham, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, that belief was set out in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament of the Bible. The creation of the world in 6 days, culminating in the creation of man on the 6th, prior to the day of rest, established the historical context for any consideration of ancient things. The very notion of prehistory could be formulated only after the development of those new ways of thought that we associate with the Enlightenment, and indeed with the scientific revolution seen in other areas of research. Prominent among those was astronomy, where the studies, and above all the observations, of Galileo and Copernicus created a new and revolutionary world-view. But, as we shall see, developments in other disciplines, including geology and natural history, formed a key part of the background of thought in front of which the notion of prehistory could emerge and develop. To understand what is meant by prehistory today, what we believe when we contemplate the deep human past, it is important to see that this is a relatively new study, and one that is changing rapidly in the face of new research techniques and new ideas about human development and change. For instance, the development of DNA studies for the reconstruction of human descent lines has had a profound effect upon the way we look at our place in the world today. The first great realization in the 19th century, which opened the way to the serious study of prehistory, was the establishment of the sheer antiquity of humankind. Before prehistory. The very idea of prehistory couldn't develop until it was realized that written historical texts were not the only possible source of information about the past, as Dr. Johnson had assumed. In the early days of archaeology, the excavations made in ancient cities and cemeteries were used to illustrate what was already known from the historical texts. Indeed, it can be argued that the birth of archaeology owes much to the passions of the great collectors, the princes and cardinals of Renaissance Italy, and the European monarchs who followed them in collecting classical statuary, antique marbles, as they were called. Charles I, when he came to the throne of England in 1625, amply testified a royal liking of ancient statues by causing a whole army of old foreign emperors, captains, and senators all at once to land on his coasts, to come and do him homage, and attend him in his palaces of St. James and Somerset House. Half a century later, Louis XIV sought to import to France, to decorate his great palace at Versailles, tout ce qu'il a de beau en Italie. Noblemen embarked on the grand tour and came back with trophy sculptures with which to decorate their stately homes. The practice of digging at ancient settlement sites for material evidence of the past was first developed to meet the tastes and desires of these early collectors. The discovery in the 18th century of the buried cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, destroyed in the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, led to more energetic and ultimately more systematic excavations, and gradually digging was established as a means of obtaining information as well as marbles and other antiquities for the cabinet of the collector. The desire to illuminate and extend the picture offered by the written text encouraged excavation in Western Asia, where it was hoped that material evidence would be found to illustrate the Old Testament of the Bible. The excavation by Paul-Émile Botta at Nineveh in 1842, and then by Austin Henry Laird at Nimrud in 1845, marked the beginning of systematic archaeology in Mesopotamia. Before long, the biblical texts that had inspired the excavations were being enhanced by the decipherment of the inscribed clay tablets found in those excavations. Egyptology and Assyriology thus had already developed systematic excavations on a large scale, even before the notion of prehistory was formulated. It was in fact in northern Europe, where the material remains of literate early civilizations were less in evidence, that the monuments of a more remote past first attracted attention. In Britain, the great monument at Stonehenge was a subject for speculation, being assigned first to the Romans, and then to the Danes, and then again to the Druids, the local priests in Anglesey mentioned in the writings of Julius Caesar. One of the first antiquaries to undertake systematic excavations in England in the burial mounds, the so-called barrows, of Wiltshire, was Sir Richard Colt Hoare, the proprietor of the mansion at Storeheed in that county. Prevented from undertaking the grand tour by the Napoleonic Wars, he instead undertook a tour of Ireland in 1806. During it he visited the great stone-built passage grave of Newgrange, which today we recognize as a megalithic tomb of the Neolithic period dating to around 3200 BCE. He was impressed, but he was also puzzled, and he expressed his puzzlement in a splendid statement that indicates the frustration of a serious scholar before the concept of prehistory and the techniques of prehistoric archaeology had been formulated. He wrote, "I shall not unnecessarily trespass upon the time and patience of my readers in endeavouring to ascertain what tribes first peopled this country, nor to what nation the construction of this singular monument may reasonably be attributed, for I fear both its authors and its original destination will ever remain unknown. Conjecture may wander over its wild and spacious domains, but will never bring home with it either truth or conviction. Alike will the histories of those stupendous temples at Avebury and Stonehenge, which grace my native county, remain involved in obscurity and oblivion." Time depth. Within half a century, the pessimism of Colt Hoare was to be replaced by the optimism of what could be claimed as a new scientific discipline. The first steps came with the so-called Northern Antiquaries, Scandinavian scholars who were already familiar with the finds from tombs and settlements that clearly dated from a period long before the existence there of written records. Christian Jørgensen Thomsen became the first curator of the Danish National Museum of Antiquities in 1816. His first task was to arrange the growing collection of the museum into some coherent order. In doing so, he realized that the artifacts of iron had to be later than many of those of bronze, and that stone tools were abundant before those of bronze came into use. This allowed him to produce a classification of 3 technological stages: of stone, bronze, and iron. His guidebook to the National Museum was translated into English in 1848 and introduced his 3-age system to the world of scholarship. It was soon widely adopted and allowed scholars to divide the pre-literate past into a sequence of periods. The study of the actual finds was now augmenting and extending the story offered by the written texts. 2 other important steps triggered the intellectual advance in the middle of the 19th century, through which the very concept of prehistory became possible. The first of these was the development of geology. Already scholars such as Georges Cuvier in France and William Strata Smith in England had recognized that the record of the rocks of the earth the successive strata with their accompanying fossils, had to imply not a single great flood, the Noachian flood of Genesis, but a more complex narrative. One approach, favoured by Cuvier, was to formulate a series of global catastrophes, of which Noah's flood would have been the last. But in 1785, James Hutton published a different gradualist approach, well summarized in his title, Theory of the Earth, or An Investigation of the Laws Observable in the Composition, Dissolution, and Restoration of Land upon the Globe. He saw that the deposits of sand, gravel, clay, and limestone of the earth were the result of the ordinary deposition of sediments, operating over a vast period of time, and that modern volcanoes give the clue to the formation of igneous rocks. He wrote, "No processes are to be employed that are not natural to the globe. No action to be admitted except those of which we know the principle." This gradualist approach, this uniformitarian principle, offered the foundation for modern geology and prepared the way also for the modern study of anthropology. This approach found its culmination in Principles of Geology, published by Sir Charles Lyell between 1830 and 1833. Again, it is worth quoting the title in full. Principles of Geology, being an attempt to explain the former changes of the earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. This key idea underlies also the development of prehistoric archaeology, but first it had to be applied to human life and experience through the material remains, both to the artifacts that were the products of human activity and to human remains themselves. Today, many of us are familiar with the chipped stone tools that are the principal evidence we have for the technology of what, following C.J. Thompson, we have come to call the Stone Age. Notable among them are the hand axes, which the French call coups de poing, or bifaces, which are large tools of chipped flint that can readily be held in the hand. To us it is inherently obvious that these tools were made by human activity, and that the changing techniques of manufacture are informative about the development of what we might call lithic technology. That was less obvious during the Renaissance, when men of learning were forming their cabinets of curiosities, and classifying all manner of natural curiosities from the world of nature, and artificial curiosities made by human action. It was sometimes thought that what we could call flint arrowheads were elf-shot, which would place them on the boundary between natural and artificial curiosities, and that flint hand-axes were to be regarded as thunderbolts, and thus natural. Ulisse Aldrovandi, one of the great zoologists of the Renaissance, described stone tools as due to an admixture of a certain exhalation of thunder and lightning with metallic matter, chiefly in dark clouds, which is coagulated by the circumfused moisture and conglutinated into a mass like flour and water, and subsequently indurated by heat like a brick. I very much like that description, which to us verges upon the nonsensical. It shows clearly that something that to us is obvious, that these flint artifacts are the result of human activity, was not obvious at all less than 4 centuries ago. Others were more willing to recognize that the so-called thunderbolts were the weapons and tools of a primitive folk ignorant of knowledge of metallurgy, and some came to compare them with the implements used by the American Indians. But how early were these implements and the people who made them? The problem was well expressed by John Freer in 1797, when he wrote to the Secretary of the Society of Antiquaries of London, submitting some flint implements of hand-axe type found at Hoxton near Diss in Suffolk. They were found 12 feet below the surface of the ground, associated with the bones of extinct animals. Freer wrote, "They are, I think, evidently weapons of war, fabricated and used by a people who had not the use of metals. The situation in which these weapons were found may tempt us to refer them to a very remote period indeed, even beyond that of the present world." We are here on the very brink of a new paradigm, beyond that of the present world, implying that the existing view of things, based upon the book of Genesis, may not be sufficient. Clearly something more is called for, but Freer is not yet willing directly to challenge received wisdom. Glyn Daniel, one of the first historians of archaeology, in his The Idea of Prehistory, published in 1962, called this observation by Freer one of the first facts in a prehistory based on archaeology. He goes on to quote the case of a German priest, Johann Esper, who excavated a cave near Bamberg, finding cave bears and other extinct animals associated with human bones. In 1774, Esper published his conclusions. Did they belong to a druid, or to an antediluvian, or to a mortal man of more recent times? I dare not presume, without any sufficient reason, these human members to be of the same age as the other animal petrifactions. They must have got there by chance, together with them. The paradigm shift that those doubts heralded came some 80 years later through the work of a French customs official, Jacques Boucher de Perthes. This was the second important step that allowed the concept of prehistory to take shape. He collected flints, including hand axes from the Somme gravels, found in gravel pits near Abbeville, calling them haches diluviennes. In 1847 he published his conclusions, calling into question Noah's flood as the explanation for the association of human artifacts and the bones of extinct animals. In 1859, the distinguished geologist Sir Joseph Prestwich and the archaeologist John Evans visited Boucher de Perthes in France. Evans wrote in his diary, "I can hardly believe it. It will make my ancient Britons quite modern if man is carried back in England to the days when elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, and tigers were also inhabitants of this country." Prestwich and Evans were persuaded. In 1859, Prestwich read a paper to the Royal Society and Evans spoke to the Society of Antiquaries. What they termed the Antiquity of Man was now generally accepted. It followed that the human past must extend back over many thousands of years. The discipline of prehistory became possible. Evolution. If the new perspectives of time depth offered by the establishment of the Antiquity of Man in 1859 made possible a time span for prehistory, it was the publication in the same year of Charles Darwin's general theory of evolution that indicated the possibility of a coherent narrative in which the place of humankind in the world could be situated. Darwin's On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection opened up a new vista, which linked the living world and its development with the principles that underlay the new geology of Hutton, Lyell, and Prestwich. To explain the former changes by references to causes now in action. That uniformitarian principle, that view of explanation, could now be applied to the living world just as it had been by Hutton and Lyell to the geological strata of the earth. Darwin's suggestion of a biological mechanism of universal application, namely the natural selection of living forms by the survival of the fittest, naturally invited the application of this mechanism to the human species also. This was a challenge that Darwin himself met in 1871 with his The Descent of Man. Ever since, this challenge has offered an invitation to anthropologists and archaeologists to document the paths and the processes by which our own species, Homo sapiens, emerged. As we shall see in later chapters, that remains one of the main questions in the study of prehistory. Darwin's great idea of evolution, however, offered a further challenge, implicit in the recognition that those hand axes recovered from the gravels of the Somme were exceedingly ancient. The concept was present also in Thomson's three-age system. The challenge presented by Darwin's theory of biological evolution is related to the idea that human culture has also changed. Perhaps in a general sense, we may say that human culture has evolved. How can we describe, then, and perhaps explain, those developments and transformations that we see over the millennia in human societies and communities? Very soon after the publication of On the Origin of Species, anthropologists and archaeologists were speaking in evolutionary terms about human culture and language, arranging developments in notional family trees as the followers of Darwin were doing for the fossil species from the living world. The great pioneer of archaeological excavation method, General Pitt Rivers, was much impressed by the way the forms of tools changed gradually through time in a manner that could be considered evolutionary. In 1875 he published diagrams showing gradual typological change, which anticipated those diagrams of the Swedish scholar Oskar Montelius. And the linguist August Schleicher, already by 1863, was explicitly applying Darwinian thinking to the evolution of languages. As we shall see in Part 2, while such descriptions of the evolution of non-biological subjects have a certain validity in broad outline, it is often less clear how these descriptions work out in more detail, and how a simplistic view of evolution from simple to complex often came to be applied to human culture. Prehistory. The word prehistory did not come into general currency until after that momentous year 1859, when the Antiquity of Man was established and Darwin's great work was published. Prehistory was first introduced a few years earlier by Daniel Wilson in 1851 in his The Archaeology and Prehistoric Annals of Scotland, but it was Sir John Lubbock's Prehistoric Times, published in 1865, that gave the term wider application. Lubbock was one of the first to divide the Stone Age into two phases. First came the Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, the time when men shared the possession of Europe with the mammoths, the cave bear, the woolly-haired rhinoceros, and other extinct animals. The epoch of cavemen. This age was followed by the Neolithic, or New Stone Age, a period characterized by beautiful weapons and instruments made of flint and other kinds of stone. Lubbock applied the age classification only to Europe, but thought that it might be applicable to Asia and Africa also. And he used ethnography, the study of living cultures, to illuminate the ways of life of the prehistoric Europeans. Among those he described were the inhabitants of Tierra del Fuego and the Andaman Islands, even now only in an age of stone, to illuminate the ways of life of the prehistoric Europeans. Above all, he was optimistic. When he wrote, "Of late years a new branch of knowledge has arisen. A new science has been born among us which deals with times and events far more ancient than any of those which have yet fallen within the province of the archaeologist." He was speaking of geology, but he went on to claim that archaeology can form the bridge that links geology and history. With the publication of Prehistoric Times, another new discipline had come into being: prehistory. The revelations of 1859, the antiquity of man and the principle of evolution, could now be utilized to develop this new study.